So this video is just a quick little overview of a tool called diagrams.net, which you can use to create flowcharts. You can create nice looking, aesthetically pleasing flowcharts that are easy to read and follow using this site, this application, and you can output them directly to like your Google Drive or your Dropbox. So it's a pretty convenient tool. You certainly don't need to use this tool. If you're more comfortable, say, making a flowchart in PowerPoint, you can do that. You can also draw it out by hand, but if you do that, make sure that it's legible. So flowcharts are really important. They're a useful tool to help you visualize a workflow. And so there's many different reasons why you might want to use a flowchart. First off, it can help you think through a problem. Laying out the steps and figuring out how you're going to do things will help you figure out how you need to order your operations and what layers to incorporate when. It can help identify possible flaws in your logic as you're thinking through things. You might be like, oh, wait, that wouldn't work. I need to do this before I can do that, right? So they can be really useful for helping you figure out what you want to do, even if you're just kind of shorthand jot one down, just as a little sketch to kind of think through your process, not formally. It can be really useful for problem solving. So it can be a great way to help you figure out what you're going to do, but also it's a great way to help others see what you did. So it's really important to be able to communicate your process, what you did, the steps that you took, and things like that, right? So that way, other people can, one, if they see your results, they can trust them because they can see what you did to get to those results. And they can gather that information fairly quickly and easily from a flowchart. It's a bit more straightforward than like reading, paragraph or two or longer description of a methodology, right? Not to say that it's not important to provide broader explanations when you're doing research, but it's nice to have a quick look at what's going on. So you can help visualize your results and support those results by visualizing your workflow and showing others what you did. And it can also serve as a template for other people who might want to recreate a certain analysis or something like that, right? So these are pretty useful tools to just kind of highlight what you want to do. When you open up this page, you get a blank window. So you might be asked to create an account when you log or when you first sign up, and you can hook up your Google Drive or your Dropbox if you want to do that. But once you get in, you'll have this blank diagram, just a little grid with space to do work. You can scroll and zoom. You see it doesn't really end. It just kind of continues, right? It's just this big empty space. And you see over on the left, you've got all these different options. You've got shapes and arrows. And so what I find useful for me personally is to use different shapes to distinguish between different things, right? So you can use one shape to represent input features, one shape to represent processes, and then maybe another shape to represent an output, for instance, right? So say you wanted to represent how you do a clip. So you create two input layers. So say this is census data. And then you've got another layer. So you've got a whole bunch of census data, say maybe the whole province, right? And then you've got another layer that's just a municipal boundary, right? So you want to just get the census data for everywhere within that city. You're not really concerned about everything else, right? So maybe you want to do a clip, right? That's a nice, easy way to do it. You can, if you click on these, you'll see that they pop up with arrows with different options, right? And they come up with different default shapes. So maybe you use a rectangle to represent input layers, then maybe you want to use, say, an oval to represent processes. And so you can just type in clip here. And then you can click the arrows as well and drag them to new connections, right? So the two inputs you need for the clip are the census data and the municipal boundary. And then you'll end up with an output. So Maybe you want to represent outputs and intermediary steps or something like that as a different shape, right? So say you call this municipal census. You can easily reshape things so that they fit better and all that, right? So say once you've got the municipal census data, maybe you've got some other processes you need. Maybe you're trying to figure out the service area for a proposed hospital, right? So you've got another input layer. We'll call this one. And in order to figure out the service area, you're going to buffer the hospital by a certain distance and then intersect that with the census data. So you'll find out the population within the service area and exclude everything else outside of that, right? So you can create a process, say buffer, and then maybe your buffer distance, right? Say you're buffering by 2 kilometers. You might want to specify that. You don't always need to give like detailed stuff in these processes, right? But if you're doing a buffer and it's, you know, a 2-kilometer buffer, might as well mention it, right? Or if you're doing a concentric ring buffer or you're buffering by a field, you might want to put that in here, right? And so then your resulting output would be another intermediary step called hospital buffer. And so then these two layers are going to be intersected, and then you'll end up with your final result, right? So you can go one more process called intersect. And you can click and drag from this one. You just click on the arrow and drag it, it will do its thing. And then you're going to get your final result. And so maybe for the final result, you want to use a different shape, right? So you could go with this. You could say final output, hospital service area, or population in service area. And so again, like the specifics of, you always have to use like a rectangle? No, like, and so like the specific choice of shape, it doesn't really matter so much, right? It's more about being consistent. So you want the reader to say, quickly be able to distinguish between certain inputs, final results, intermediary steps, processes, things like that, right? So whether you use squares or rectangles or diamonds or triangles doesn't really matter. It's more about consistency. So this would be a quick, really just like rough sketch of how you might create this service area. Now, anyone who, now if you got much out of the lecture on spatial overlay or watching the extra videos that I present this week, you might say, hey, well, nobody really needs to do this clip, right? Because the intersect with the hospital buffer will be enough to just get the census data that we want. We don't really need to clip by the municipal boundary, right? And so maybe in thinking through this flow chart, you realize, hey, there's an extra step I don't need to do, right? And then you could take that out. This was just an example I kind of thought up on the fly. So, you know, I added an extra step that didn't really need to be there. That said, keeping the clip is not going to in any way, shape, or form detract from the results. And depending on the circumstances, if you have a very large census data layer, it still might be a good idea to clip it down to your study area before doing your analysis. But anyway, that is just an aside, right? But this highlights that you can look through flowchart and then you can maybe find redundancies or find errors and things like that. So this is just a quick rough look at what you can do, but there's more options. If you click this style, you can also say change the colors of your different objects. So you can click on an individual shape and say change the color. So in addition to or instead of using different shapes to delineate, say, inputs versus outputs and intermediary steps, you could use rectangles to represent every single layer and circles to represent every single process if you want, but then you could just distinguish things by colors. Or you can do both, again, to make it a little more explicit. So maybe all the input layers are going to be blue. And so the default color choices are quite good, and they will work for most purposes. And say you want your final output to be red. Maybe you make your processes yellow and your intermediary steps can just stay white, for instance, or maybe you want to make them orange. Again, there's not really any like rules here. It's just you want to try and make things aesthetically pleasing. So I'll leave these just to highlight that they're intermediary steps. We're not really doing anything with them other than using them to create a final result, right? And so this is just a rough look at a diagram. Pretty simple, easy, straightforward. And if you show this to someone else, then they can know pretty much exactly what you did. And it would make it easier for them to repeat your analysis or potentially think of possible flaws. You know, somebody else looking at this might say, hey, that clip's unnecessary, right? So it's fairly easy and straightforward to create diagrams with this. And you can save your work. If you click save, you might want to rename it, say test diagram, maybe save it again. And then because I've linked mine to my Google Drive, it saves there. If you link yours to a Dropbox account, it will save there. I believe you can also just kind of output it like to your email instead, if you prefer. You can share it with other people on Google if you want, for instance. The way you get the final document is you go to export, and then you can export it as a variety of different file types, PDF, for instance. And so you can choose your different options. You can make the background transparent. You want it to show a grid or crop it to a certain area. I'm just going to leave it all as default. You all can play around with different options if you want. And so I'm going to save mine directly to Google Drive. But again, you see there's other options. You can put it on your device. You can put it on GitHub, Dropbox, OneDrive, lots of different options. And so now my test diagram is going to be saved to my Google Drive. And if you go to, or if I go to my Google Drive, I'll now see there's a test diagram .draw.io. And you'll notice that the PDF does not work very well, right? So maybe you try a PNG file instead. So I find that these generally work better because the PDF is going to try to fit it to a standard sized print page, whereas a PNG file is an image and it's going to be set specifically to the bounds of the image instead. So the PDF one's a little wonky. And so now you see there's also a PNG file here. And it has everything neatly laid out, right? And so I'm not saying that this is the specific style guide that you should follow or the specific color choices or anything like that. But this is just a reference to show you how to go about creating a flowchart. And so we're going to have you have to do a flowchart for your final project. And so this will be a good tool for that. We also have a flowchart question on the final exam. And so this might be a good option for you on that as well. Again, you can draw it out by hand or create it in a different software package if you want. You're certainly not stuck using this, but this is a free open source option that anyone can access. So it might be a good option for you.